Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar, New Frontiers in Research and Technology, the Future of Research and Equity in the Metaverse. And now, Nanette Coleman, PhD candidate at the University of California, Berkeley, and SICSS-Howard Mathematica founder and lead organizer, will introduce our speakers and moderate today's panel. Nanette, the floor is yours.
Thank you all for joining us for SICSS-Howard Mathematica Live Q&A. This represents our second open session where we are inviting folks from other SICSS locations. I would like to pause and particularly shout out SICSS Covenant in Nigeria, SICSS JIAS IPAC in South Africa, and SICSS West Africa and Central Africa and Cameroon. I know Cameroon has a special place in the heart of one of our speakers whose family is from Cameroon. So thank you for joining us. Our panelists are excited to jump into the work and get to some questions with what represents our first New Frontiers in Research and Technology panel at SICSS-Howard Mathematica. We will be focusing on the future of research and equity in the metaverse. I will also add ethics to that, research, equity, and ethics in the metaverse panel. This session is a complement to the individual videos from each of our speakers that are available on our site. Many of you have already watched those, but our speakers, Andre Brock, Courtney Cogburn, Kyla McMullen, and Danielle M Olsen will all also give you an overview of that in the event that you are joining us for the first time. So we're going to make our way around the group. Kyla has, I'm not volunteering, she volunteered.
No, you are the boss. I will do it.
So Kyla, I'm going to hold you to that. So Kyla is going to kick us off with an introduction of herself and also give us some large takeaways from the video you may or may not have watched. Take it away, Kyla.
Yeah, thank you, Nanette. So I'm Dr. Kyla McMullen. I'm a soon-to-be associate, so that's why it says associate, like literally days I will hear about this favorably, I'm anticipating, professor at the University of Florida, and I'm in the Computer and Information Science and Engineering department. A whole lot of words for computer science. My virtual reality research, augmented reality research really concentrates on creating realism, on making sure people are fully immersed, especially in the auditory domain. I do lots of work with 3D audio, and I've also recently branched out into other sorts of VR and AR applications, such as in the medical context and first responder context. So I'm very, very happy to talk with you all about this because as I've developed these sorts of things, you know, VR and the metaverse are very tightly coupled. So there's lots of ethical challenges and questions that come up. So if you didn't have a chance to take a look at the video, I can give you the cliff notes. So one of the great things about VR is that we create technology in such a way that you feel like you're actually there. So it's a good thing and a bad thing because the trauma and harassment that you might experience also feel as though you're there. You know, it can feel as though you are experiencing it in actual life. You know, some people may say, oh, it's a game, it's a headset, take it off. But there are haptic responses, there are verbal responses, there's lots of things that that just don't go away. You know, it's not just a game. And then people are further emboldened oftentimes and do things that they wouldn't necessarily say online, say in person or do in person. And it's even easier to deny that you did something because there was a study where there was a woman who worked at Facebook who was being harassed in a game and she couldn't even track down the person that was bothering her. So I just wanted to talk about just a lot of just issues here and how we don't even have all of our ethical issues just figured out in the real world. So how do we think transporting everyone to this metaverse, we're just magically going to figure these things out? So I suggested using design justice, which is a way of centering the voices of the people who are impacted the most negatively by this to help co-design the metaverse, the policies, the ethical practices of the metaverse so that it can be a more equitable place. And then I go into some reasons why this is important because of the research on the metaverse just being largely non-inclusive. So I won't give you the whole talk, but that is the skimming, and I can't wait for the rest of our panel.
Thank you so much for kicking us off in beautiful fashion, associate professor. Love to hear that. I'm still you know, working on this PhD, so I hope to be all when I grow up at some point. And with that in mind, thinking of who I want to grow up to be, I would like to introduce Brother Andre to introduce himself and his research. He has a habit of saying things to me that cut through. In the very short time I've known him, he has become an exceptional mentor. So I'm excited for you all to see and to meet this phenom that I've gotten to spend some time with recently.
What's the prompt again?
What's your name? Where are you from? What do you do? And give us the cliff notes on your presentation, to quote Kyla.
My name is Dr. Andre Brock.
Yes.
I am a twice tenured associate professor at Georgia Tech. I wrote a book that you can have for free because I don't care about making money for my kids. Them kids will be all right, which is called Distributed Blackness. My research, broadly described, is race in the digital, mostly focusing on Black people, but also paying attention to the foolishness that white people do. My talk, if you took time to watch it, pretty much covers a lot of these things. I come at this information/data perspective from a humanist perspective, which is good because I get to pick out things that y'all might not have noticed in your rush to acquire all your skills and programming and everything else, right? So I largely focus on belief systems, particularly what it means to be Black. So we could talk a little bit about anti-Blackness and Afro-pessimism, but also the epistemologies of ignorance that whiteness enforces on us as we drive for positivism, objectivism, and rationality in computer systems. So we can talk about all that when y'all are ready.
Thank you so much. We're going to jump to Danielle. We are working on getting Courtney Cogburn connected. We're having some connection problems with her. So when she's able to join us, we'll cycle back around and have her introduce herself. But in the meantime, I would like to introduce you to the fantastic, wonderful, brilliant Danielle Olsen, who we found by way of her amazing advisor at MIT. I reached out to him and he's like, not me, needs to be Danielle. So please introduce yourself and give us the cliff notes, Danielle.
Awesome. Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon. So excited to be here. I've learned from so many of the other panelists through their academic research. So just it's an honor to be here, and I can't wait to have discussion today. So I'm Dr. Danielle M Olsen. I just finished my PhD at the MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab last June. So it's coming up on 1 year anniversary of wrapping up that chapter in my life. These days, I work as an AI/ML human factors researcher at Apple in Seattle, Washington. So here I'm really thrilled that I get to be somebody who's always advocating for the human experience at every single step of the development process. Apple aspires to build products and experiences for everyone. Obviously, you know, a lot of the times these days, machine learning powers those experiences, from hand washing with your Apple Watch to stop the spread of COVID to detecting activities, or even assisting blind customers in navigating apps. So all of that is powered by machine learning, and we have to ensure that, you know, voices are heard at every step of the way. So that's what I do here. But in my previous life at MIT, under the direction of my advisor, Professor Fox Harrell, I studied social modeling in computational simulations, specifically with a focus on race and ethnicity. What motivated me to pursue that was that I love storytelling from the time I was a child, and I was always fascinated by, you know, these emerging media technologies, from museum exhibits to VR headsets. But I noticed that a lot of emphasis was placed only on the visual component, which is extremely important. I'm sure we're going to talk about that today. But I also wanted to understand, given that we know how diverse that our phenotypes are within the African diaspora, what about beyond what we look like? What about the things, the histories, the social structures, the embodied experiences that shape the way we think about racial issues? I think it's a really important time right now to think about you know, politics and Blackness. Like, we have folks on the Supreme Court who might be part of a demographic group, but don't represent or speak on behalf of many of us, right? We have talking heads on Fox News, right, that don't reflect my politics, at least. And so I was fascinated by that and wanted to understand what is a different way we can represent the way that race intersects with the way that we respond to racialized stimuli, and how can we use that for storytelling purposes as well as educational purposes. So I was really lucky to meet Dr. Rihanna Elise Anderson, who is a licensed clinical psychologist and assistant professor in the Health, Behavior, and Health Education Department at University of Michigan. She created an intervention called Embrace, or Engaging, Managing, and Bonding Through Race for Black Families and Youth, which teaches about racial and ethnic socialization, which is how we teach our children to think about race and ethnicity as they grow up. And we get socialized from a variety of sources, from our parents to our communities to the media. So my dissertation really borrows from that literature and applies it to computational systems so that we can better kind of represent these things in order to tell more engaging, immersive stories. So can't wait to talk to you all and answer some questions today, but I'm sure I'm going to be learning a lot today. So excited about that.
This is such a new frontier here, as noted in the name of our panel. So I too am a sponge here. I'm very excited to hear from you all. I think some of our questions from our participants will also guide us all into deeper learning as well. While we wait to try and connect our final speaker, I'm going to jump in with the first question. This has to do with the anonymity that I think Kyla brought up, and I'm hoping everyone will weigh in. So what are the trade-offs for allowing people to use anonymous identities versus asking them to always identify themselves? Is it better to have a model closer to how Facebook currently works? One account must be a person or a business, supposedly. That is not always the case. There are enough trolls out there for us to know that that is not always the case. Or allow more anonymity, as in like Instagram, where people can have multiple accounts, could be anything, anyone. So again, bringing that real world into conversation with the existing models. What do you think? Is there something better?
So I'm glad you mentioned anonymity, because I was taking a look at some papers about like anonymity and how, like, especially in teenagers, it helps them. Like sometimes some teens don't feel like they have a sense of community. So they'll share things online that they may not share with the people around them. So that gives them this sense of community, but not like identifying information, more like my day is going like this, my family is structured like this. So I think it's positive in that way, because the anonymity gives people this sort of boldness to share and, and be a part of each other's lives. But then at the same time, the anonymity also emboldens other people to do things that they would not do if they were in person. So in terms of what model they should employ, I really think that it needs to be tied back to you as a person. And I feel like that would help us to avoid a lot of the issues that we have, because otherwise, like, I'm not getting in the metaverse, because if it's just the wild, wild west and people can do whatever they want and nobody's regulating it, then, it's kind of like you go in, but you understand the rules. But if we want this to be something that people truly engage with safely and actually learn from and get benefit out of, I think it does need to be tied back to some identifying characteristic. But then there's back and forth with that too, because then you can use that. You can always hack and breach databases, whatever stores that mapping from the anonymous person to the not anonymous person, that can always be hacked. People can, be victims of having like their information leaked and things like that. So it's a catch-22. I don't know.
Other panelists want to weigh in?
So this question of anonymity is kind of archaic, right? Especially when you're thinking about Meta and their Metaverse, which is the 17th iteration of a virtual reality that people consensually share, like Second Life or Club Penguin, or like we could go way back, right? And so no shade to the person who asked the question, but what does it mean to be anonymous by name when the network already records your client, your ISP, the browser you're using, the cookie settings you have, what extensions you have, what your connections are? Anonymity from a name perspective is kind of superfluous at that point, particularly given the skill with which Meta/Facebook, I'm gonna stop calling them Meta, Facebook has developed this intense vacuum to suck up every bit of information you provide them thanks to their social graph, right? So anonymity is not the right question to be asking. The question to ask is, how much of ourselves do we consent to give up to participate in these spaces? And that becomes different. And so Dr. McMullen's query, I'm going to tangent, but so that's one thing to consider. Dr. McMullen's comment about anonymity and the freedom it gives people to participate is something I've been intensely interested in since I started looking at comments 20 years ago on blogs and live journal and spaces like that. And what I found is that when white folk want to say wild shit, they'll say wild shit regardless of what their name is. So when Facebook was first introduced as a commenting platform to supplement things like Discus, which I know most of y'all are probably too young, but my old heads will know what I'm talking about. right? When Facebook was used, it was presumed that the use of people's real names would stop them from saying, I'm going to use a technical term, wild shit when they posted online, and they did not. They
I
actually
prefer
doubled down and tripled down.
fuckery. I
Okay,
personally
fuckery
prefer
works for
Tom
me,
Fuckery.
right?
Yes.
So the idea that anonymity will somehow and protect people, particularly those who are minoritized, is wrong. People who are going to do wild shit, fuckery, will do it to minoritized people if they can detect through any number of social signals that we give off, whether it's my use of profanity to signal how intelligent I am, or my use of Black commonplaces to signal my participation in that community. Those people are really skilled at finding ways to troll/bully others, right? So yeah, let's reframe this question. Instead of anonymity, what harm reduction can we do by encouraging platforms to reduce as much of a data profile as possible so that we can have lives in and outside of this platform?
Yeah.
Would you like to weigh in as well, Danielle?
Yeah, just a like little maybe tangential to this, but I love that point because there was actually a paper that came out several years ago that showed that even if you don't collect any personally identifiable information within a VR session, your gestural movements and interactions in that space can actually be used to identify you. So when we think about this, it's like, what do we actually mean when we say anonymity? Is it that we're obfuscating their identity to other users in that space? Or is it the creator or the host or the platform that they're in? Are they going to be able to identify that user? How is that going to be linked to across their behaviors, like in digital traces in other contexts? So I think like that's a really challenging thing these days. Like we keep talking about this. So yeah, I think it's a really like with technical precision, we know that it's really, really difficult to actually have true anonymity these days, right?
And I will add, on a regular basis, I go through my privacy settings, and I recently realized how many of the apps I use on a regular basis want to detect my movements in the space or map the room around me. So there's all sorts of things that are collected that can help to identify if an organization or company is actually interested in doing that. Instead of protecting bad actors. So I will throw out the question of, because I think we're on the periphery of regulation and also potentially discussing cost. Do you all see a space where if we were charged for these different systems, we might have greater power? The fact that so many of these things are quote unquote free, and yet we're batteries fueling the economy in this space. Is there a place for cost, or how do we think about, or are we at a point of regulation? Feel free, anybody, please jump in.
Expand on that a little bit. So in cost in terms of what, like charging up? Yeah, can you just expand on that a little?
Yeah, so do you, if we were being charged, like for Facebook, if we were paying to use Facebook or MySpace, to go way back, would we have more rights in this space? And then also, what thoughts on regulation? Are we at a point yet? And yeah, let's go from there.
That's a good point. That's a good question. My immediate feeling is no. If we were charged, I don't have any real.
It was a softball question. No.
But I'm just thinking about, there's so many spaces that we pay for to be in and act as though it's a privilege to pay to be there, but we are still not allowed all the same. Yeah, payment does not equal, in my opinion, payment does not equal rights.
Anyone else, or want to jump in on that or regulation?
It's the hardware question, right?
Yeah, sure.
For those of us who are fortunate enough to be able to afford either the amortization plans where you can get an Apple iPhone for a few dollars a month, or outright buy it, right? Or subscription plans. Many of the Apple phones, and I would even add the Exynos chips and Samsung phones and others, are powerful enough to run desktops. Right. So the hardware question is not necessarily the question I'm as concerned with, given the vast majority of folk on the continent of Africa and in India are running what we wouldn't consider smartphones, but are very powerful phones in their own right. Right. And so the question of access to me is not a hardware issue as it is reconfiguring our overly complicated platform to address the capacities of mobile, and not just the computational problems, right? The interface issues, right? The things that you want to be able to do on a touch-enabled screen should not exactly try to replicate what you can do on a mouse keyboard I'm looking at a 32-inch curved monitor, it should not be trying to replicate that. So it requires a rethinking of the affordances available to the populations you're wishing to try. It's not a deficit model. It's not a digital divide model. It's again, an epistemology of access, right? Of trying to think only in the paradigms available to you, as opposed to what is available to the people you're wishing to reach.
I think I see the pivot that you made, and I'm going to rephrase this for our panelists. So I think where we're headed is trying to understand and address reliance on hardware that limits access and reach, so especially for underrepresented groups. So how do we address that? So Kyla or Danielle, do you want to follow suit with Andre and head in that direction?
One of the things, I guess, just to make it personal, my dissertation research, we used mobile VR headsets. There's always some discourse on Twitter that's bashing mobile VR headsets, and there's reasons for it in terms of like motion sickness vulnerability because of the frame rate not being as high as like, you know, what you get with like a plugged in headset or, you know, a very expensive one. But for me, for the population and the community that I was intending to work with for this work, it was way more important to me to ensure that we were using mobile devices, given that like everything Dr. Brock just said, right? And so, you know, having a $10, $12 plastic or cardboard headset with an existing device that's already in my pocket, think like that access piece is so critical. And I think there's always going to be trade-offs, right? If you have folks that are really vulnerable to motion sickness, then yeah, there's technological like advancements we need to make to improve that experience. But yeah, there's always going to be that gap, right? There's always like this, I don't know, audience that I think big corporations like Facebook always tend to build for, which are like, you know, the early adopters, even though we know there's plenty of people who are early adopters of technology that, you know, aren't in the specific demographics that they often think about and prioritize. So yeah, anyway, I think it just depends on, like, again, always context matters. Like, what are the sort of applications we're trying to build? What are they for? And then I think like with that, you have to consider the social, economic and other factors before you just jump for the technology first. That's just my personal belief.
So we had an interesting presentation by Karen Levy yesterday, who's on faculty, recent associate professor also at Cornell, who studies truckers. So, and she was talking about how vulnerable that population is and how the early adopters of technology, most of us don't think about that. So they're in the background often, and how they're uniquely aware of the privacy invasions because within the space that they work. So I want to pivot this back and make sure we don't get far away from our vulnerable populations. So SICSS-Howard Mathematica is focused on anti-Black racism and inequity. So what I'd like you all to think about is what are some of the largest concerns that you have about vulnerable populations and with this technology and other technologies in the space, and what are some of your greatest excitements about that could also potentially come? I have to tell you, I'm definitely on team, you know, concerns. I'm not in a space of excitement yet, but if somebody else is there, please go ahead and take that. Who'd like to start us off?
I'd like to start. So one of the pieces of caution is, as you mentioned, you know, this reliance on this and the early adopters. Early adopters are usually white males, Democratic, straight, et cetera, et cetera. And the early adopters are basically the alpha testers. They are the people who give feedback. But if they don't look like us, we may not actually require whatever changes it is that they're asking for. They're tailoring it to fit this population that we weren't even allowed to be a part of. So that is definitely one huge issue with, you know, the early adoption and having hardware that, you know, we may not be able to get until the second, third, fourth generation of it, but it's already been tailored to not fit us because you've only asked the opinions of people who don't look like us. So that's definitely, you know, one issue. But it's all, for me, it's all about community. I do see one positive of this being like, oh, if I'm the one Black kid who's experiencing X and I live in Kansas, you know, being able to have community in a place where you don't. So I'm like you, Nanette, I'm not at the excited place, but I do see where it can go. I just don't know what the path is going to look like to get there.
How you feeling, Andre?
So this question is interesting to me, in part because I feel as if in many ways, Black academics are separate from the communities that they were born in and bring different concerns that are structured by the institutions they live in to understanding what it means to be a minoritized population, right?
Mm.
And so I remember I wrote an article 100 years ago about a browser called Blackbird. And Blackbird was fantastic because it was developed by 3 Black developers who decided to mob up a Mozilla instance and make it suitable for Black people. They added things that they thought Black people would like, right? Including links to the social networking sites at the time, something that actually previewed what we do now with GoFundMe. They had a giving channel that was dedicated to the browser, all kind of cool shit. But the most interesting reactions were from the Black folk who were already online in the mid 2000s, late 2000s. And one of the first things they said is, who are these Black people? Right. And I call this the Sofu restaurant theory of Blackness. Like if somebody you don't know opens up a Sofu restaurant in your neighborhood, are you going to go rush to eat there? No, you don't know whether they can cook
Nope.
greens. You don't know if their mama dropped her diabetes medication and the sweet potatoes and all of a sudden you sleepier for no reason, right? We also are very much aware and critical that technologies deployed to us and for us are not
Can't have no
necessarily
raisins in the potato salad.
right. They're not necessarily made with our interests at heart. And that includes a class situation, right? Do you want HBCU grads who had to cut their locks off to do business school telling you how to run your life in terms of what type of apps you should use? So when this question comes up, I have a vast body of research that I read and that I've written, right? That I can say, well, there are certain things brown folk need, right? But I'm also aware that brown folk have a folk expertise that doesn't cleanly map on to academic expertise. And so this current phase of my research, I'm trying to highlight that folk already know what they need and what they can't get and what they should have, right? And so the first question I ask is, have you talked to the stakeholders about what their philosophies of technology are, right? And what they see as limitations. And that from that perspective, you can then talk about what minority groups should be concerned about instead of trying to just apply an academic lens.
And I will say, we are not a monolith. So people will be looking to this panel and be like, well, we could remake the metaverse after this panel with these great experts. You know, we're, no, there's so much knowledge. Danielle, do you want to jump in?
I'm nodding so like aggressively right now. And also, by the way, if my audio is muffled, I know Dr. Brock just let me know. I just tried to improve it. So just let me know if it's a little better. But yeah, so just kind of jumping into some of the research that I did in grad school with Dr. Anderson. So racial and ethnic socialization has uncovered like certain like dominant themes in the way that we socialize our children to think about race. And it ranges from the most dominant one in the US across like non-minoritized groups, which is color blindness and egalitarianism, which is selling this myth that we live in a post-racial society. You know, we voted for Obama, so therefore, like, if a Black person can be president, there's no racism anymore. And it's like, that's a huge socialization strategy that folks use, right? And they sell this myth. In contrast, we have alertness to discrimination. So teaching children to be alert to the fact that discrimination and racial barriers do exist in society. There's preparation for bias. So teaching children coping strategies to be prepared to respond to these instances. And lastly, promotion of mistrust, which is sometimes promoting a healthy mistrust of those that are not in your racial or ethnic group in order to kind of reduce the likelihood of harm. And most people have a combination of these socialization strategies, but you can imagine if you were primarily socialized to be colorblind in comparison to someone who had promotion of mistrust and alertness to discrimination, we're going to think about these things in completely different ways. So back to that example that Dr. Brock shared of like who built this, you know, I would want to understand, you know, what were the various socialization strategies that person experienced through childhood, adolescence, young adulthood. What are the sorts of media we talk about? There's this amazing article on racialized pedagogical zones, and I know Dr. Cogburn is here and just wrote a new article on like whiteness in social media context and how it socializes us. But we have to think about like the way that we are exposed and consume media and how that affects the way that we like conceptualize these things. Even if we belong to the same like technical demographic group, we could be completely different. We could experience things completely differently. So that was what my kind of research wanted to get at. And I think like, you know, if we want to borrow that lens to think about these issues, I think it oftentimes will take us further than just looking at race and gender alone, you know?
And I want to echo your excitement about Dr. Cogburn joining us. I'm hoping that they have audio. Dr. Cogburn, are you there? So we're going to wait for you to unmute, and then we're hoping for an introduction, and perhaps you can start with the paper that Danielle just mentioned. So, I have a question for you, and I'm struggling with it a little bit because our session is all about how we bring our identities into this space, right? That we don't strip that off. And a question that was submitted to us is, in a virtual reality, how might concepts grounded in physical reality, like citizenship, healthcare, jurisdiction, community, and identity, change? I think the intention was, might it be stripped away and replaced with something better? But we're the culture, and I don't plan to strip off my Blackness when I walk into any space. So let's. How are you all thinking about that question? Are there elements of that appeal to you? Are there things about that question that repulse you? So let's hear your thoughts.
Can you rephrase this complicated question for the slow people like me?
Okay, so in a virtual reality, how might, and it's in the chat box, in a virtual reality, how might concepts grounded in physical reality, like citizenship, healthcare, jurisdiction, community, and identity, change or not matter anymore?
I don't think they would change because we still have lots of physical processes and things in practice that people are pretty wary, at least in my experience. I feel like lawmakers, policymakers are usually wary of virtual solutions to things, like things that were paper-based for so long are just now becoming digitized. So I don't think that some of these, and then there's a lot of concepts here. So citizenship, not so much. Healthcare, we already have, some telehealth things, and telehealth was already a budding research area. And then COVID happened and people are like, oh my gosh, now we can go to the doctor. Like we could do this the whole time, but now, we have this push, and now we can have more equity in terms of healthcare because people don't have to travel and take off work or take off as much time from work to be able to attend these kinds of appointments and things. So I definitely think that, healthcare, telehealth, community, I'm all about community. So I feel like community will definitely improve because, the internet is the greatest connector of people. So I think it will continue to do those things. Jurisdiction, not so sure what their jurisdiction means in this context, but I don't know, things that have like these federal sorts of federal things that are already in place, not so much, but things that we kind of create ourselves that are people dictated, like healthcare, community, things that have like some sort of flow to it, some sort of malleability. I feel like, they'll evolve.
Anyone else want to jump in? You'll notice I whipped off my headset because it died. We're live, people. Yes, continue. Just throw it across the room.
I really like design tools to think with, because like I don't like to refer to the metaverse as almost like this like passive thing that's like generic. Like we have to remember it's an active medium that like developers, designers, like business people embed our values into. And so I like to look at it like, let's expose what values they've embedded into this. So like looking at those, there's this plug for my advisor's book, Phantasmal Media. There's this thing called the blended identity diagram. And you can look at our physical world identity, our virtual world identity, and our blended identity, which kind of comes together based on like, what do we preserve from our physical world identity into the virtual world? What do we drop off in that mapping from like one space to another? And so, thinking about things like affordances of movement, maybe in the physical world, like I am a wheelchair user, and in the virtual world, I can walk or I can fly. These are different things that you would embed into the system. So I think those choices about citizenship, healthcare, jurisdiction, community identity, those are like really fascinating things to kind of like unpack and look at, like, what did they choose to map from the physical world into the digital world? Why or why not? Like, why would that be appropriate or inappropriate depending on the space? And within, I think like the metaverse is so broad and vast. Like, let's just look at the container model of like a space like Rec Room VR, and you can like within that larger space, you can go to different rooms that might have different rules about gravity, physics, motion, etc. Like you could instantiate different combinations of mappings and all of those like little subspaces for different goals. So I think like just to kind of change the question around, I think like it's a process of like revealing and understanding like why did the developers choose to preserve or not preserve certain things from the physical world into the digital space, and what harms or benefits might that cause?
Andre? Yes.
Y'all ready?
Ready, drop it.
All right. What if I told you that under the Cartesian model, you were always already virtual. How can I tell you that your Blackness, at least according to many scholars of Black studies across the last 150 years, was virtual and not necessarily tied to your physical embodiment? Right. So one of the things I've been writing about, and I tried to really touch on it in the book, but I still need to work on it, is that Blackness can also be informational. Right. There's a fantastic study from the mid 80s where they did they actually had people listen to different women on the phone, right? Black women from the South, Black women from the North, white women from the Midwest, from the West. And without fail, every caller could recognize the Black woman's voice on the phone. And the phone is one of the first virtual spaces you may have encountered, right? Where are you when you're on the phone for 4 hours with your boo thing laying in bed at night, right? You're in an intimate space that the two of y'all created using this technology, but you're also in bed. Right. And so I think Dr. Olsen's comment about that mediated space between your physical, your virtual, and your hybrid is something seriously to consider. But I want to stay for a second in that virtuality that Blackness affords you. Right. If you are using a virtual reality headset, take that back. Let's say you're using a laptop and you're chatting with your people and you're in a Starbucks. At any point, the Starbucks manager could call the police on you and say, you don't belong in here. This has happened to multiple Black business owners trying to conduct business in Starbucks, as people with Apple laptops tend to do, right? So I see little use in separating the virtual from the physical, when even when you're in a virtual space, you are still occupying a physical reality that is subject to being captured or apprehended by white supremacy at any time, or misogyny. How many women have been on the phone talking with their friends and some dude rolls up on them trying to holler, right? Snatches you right out of your group chat where you're discussing the glories of JT and Carisha at the BET Awards, and this rusty ass, musty ass dude is rolling up on you trying to holler to him, oh, you smell good, right? Your physicality will always have ascendancy regardless of what virtual space you're in. They can distract us with the simulacra, right? But I think it's signal for us to hold on to our Blackness. And this actually applies to whiteness as well, because one of the tenets of whiteness has been from jump, right? Even before Descartes, right? The idea that white people feel your spirit is somehow separate from your body, right? Even though there are multiple animistic and theistic religions on the continent of Africa and India and Asia who say, no, the body and the spirit are together. You have to work with one to get the other one to work. White folk have ascribed to this belief that is not actually originating in Europe. It's actually coming from Mesopotamia, right? The Manichaean duality, right? That your spirit is somehow should always be separate from your body. And white folk can afford to do that, because when they separate their spirit from their body, the police are bound to serve and protect them. They're not going to get interrupted at Starbucks. Ask me how I know, right? I've seen white folk bring entire computers, not laptops, desktops and monitors and keyboards and mouses and they dog to Starbucks, and nobody says a word. Right. So understand that the physicality that we're trying to disassociate from when we go into these virtual spaces, that capacity is only available to certain groups of people, right? Largely white men, right? And if you begin from that design principle, right, how to make that abolition that's available to white men available to everybody, I think Dr. Olsen and Dr. I'm going to say your last name, McMullen. Yes, are really onto something where they say we need to be attentive to not only hybrid possibilities, but epistemological understandings of what this virtuality means for people of color. How's that for a long answer?
Love it, love it, love it, love it. So I'm going to ask a research question, and then we're going to start. I love all the little fire emojis going by right now. So I'm going to ask a research question, and then I'm going to jump to questions from our audience. So we have collected some, but we also would love to see some in the chat box for folks that are just joining us for the first time. Since we started 10 minutes late, we will end 10 minutes late. I don't want to cut short all of the amazing comments and knowledge that I'm seeing here. So the question is, since this is about research, and we've spent a lot of time in the ethics and equity space and talking about the Black body both in and out of virtual reality, and I deeply appreciate you taking us back to Descartes there. What impediments do you see for conducting research in these new technologies, and what can be done now to ready the scientific community? So what are the impediments? If you're not already doing research in this space, what do you see to be impediments for you being able to do research in these space? And how can we ready our community?
I'll start if
I was just going to say, I bought some virtual reality headsets, and it's like thinking about going into the dark web. There's some shit there, and you got to be careful. So what can we do to ready ourselves?
So I'm glad you asked. So as we mentioned before, a lot of VR is created for people who are white, male, from a fairly, middle-class background, straight, et cetera, population. But doing research in this area tends to also focus on research participants who are only in this area. So a lot of the things that get published and are written as the gold standard don't apply to everyone. So some things that we can do to get ready is to place emphasis on population diversity. So having these research papers actually say the demographics, not just, 15 males and 13 females, say, and they were white and they were all from this particular area of town, so we can know how to contextualize this and not just generalize for the entire population. And also for the people who are doing the research, you don't get to just get away with only picking the people who are convenient to you. Recruit people from outside of the university who are in the community that you're in, or outside of that community, or come from a background that does not look like the people who are around the university. Reevaluating the evaluation metrics using inclusive imagery, because if you just go to a random, middle school and you're conducting a VR, you have to actually appeal to the people who you want to be in the study. A lot of people don't have a good, or they may not know what VR is, or they, your imagery may be all white men and they're doing all this and they're like, I don't do that, I don't know what that looks like. So you need to figure out a way to appeal to people who may not feel like they fit in this, and developing like really good relationships with affinity groups makes the most sense, and not just, what can I take from you, but hey, I would like to design and keep this population in mind. I'm going to pay for your Uber to and from the experiment. I pay you for your participation in the experiment. Once you're done, I'll actually share the results with you, making this sort of relationship less than I'm just going to take from you and, come do my experiment. I'm not going to pay you. I'm going to waste all your time, etc. Diversifying the people in charge, because not everyone is thinking this way. It takes, I think about it because I am a Black woman, but there are tons of collaborators, people who are in the community that could not care less about having Black people, having any sort of diverse population in their research, yet they are just touted as these forerunners in our area, and these people who just know so much. I'm like, but you know so much by excluding an entire demographic of people. So diversify the folks in charge. And so I'll stop there, but those are my initial thoughts in that direction.
I'm not sure who wants to go next, but I will add that I recently heard about a public speaking class at my alma mater, the Harvard Kennedy School, where people were using VR headsets to present to an audience, and the entire audience was white. Like, nobody thought of that. So what are companies doing to regularly check and not just perform DEI, but actually showing and investing time in making sure the things that they're producing and the work that they're doing supports the things that we're doing. So Danielle or Andre, do you want to jump in next?
I can keep this short. I swear. 3 things: funding models, research productivity models, and institutions, right? Those are the biggest impediments to me, in part because as social science and computational researchers, you're often pushed to chase funding models that are inconsistent with the ethical and moral principles that we care to hold, that we claim we hold, right? If you're working for the Department of Defense, you might be saying, oh, well, this is just for those terrible Russians, and not thinking that the same technologies have been used against folk in Libya and Morocco and Tanzania and the like. Like, you get to, and Microsoft and Amazon have run head on into these issues, right? I believe Microsoft employees pushed back against their the use of software for a government contract. I'm sorry, surveillance software similar to Palantir, and like, they pushed back and got them to turn down the contract. But that money is out there. Somebody's going to take that money. Amazon's going to take that money, right? The other part is research productivity. So if you're pushing researchers to continually iterate in the guise of innovation and to say that this is how you will get tenure or get promoted, You're not going to have people who take the time to get to know communities, as Dr. McMullen said, right? They won't get to know communities. They won't get to know stakeholders. And most importantly, they will very rarely reach outside of themselves and the community that they fit in with the most to actually look at the ways other people live their lives, understand alternative epistemologies, right? So I see a direct connection between how many articles you're pushed to publish or how many books you're asked to write and your inability to connect with communities. Last part is institutions, right? I am at Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech was put in the center of Black neighborhoods in Atlanta. Georgia Tech they barely recruit any students from Atlanta public schools, right? They prefer to recruit students from the suburbs because the suburb school systems are better, meaning they're not as Black, right? And as such, they leave behind a ton of talent. I don't know if any of your students or faculty folk are familiar with this organization called Posse. I was a Posse mentor for a couple of years a long time ago. And one of the things I love about Posse is it takes the students who don't necessarily score tops on the SAT, ACT, and the like, but they're smart kids, right? And they send them as cohorts to elite schools that otherwise they would not have gone to. They go tuition free, right? And we need more models like that to look for other we look for alternative measures of excellence and possibility beyond standardized tests, which were designed to admit students, but also in terms of faculty hiring practices, there's more than 10 universities that produce talented PhDs. No shade to MIT, right? But I was at Michigan for years, and Michigan would say, we only really want people from peer universities. So hiring practices at institutions come in that as well. Okay, so I said I was going to be short. I'll stop.
All right, Danielle, did you want to jump in with a comment, and then we'll hit you with your first direct question?
Everything they said, plus I just want to add one more thing, which we talked about earlier, which is like not like anti-deficiency stances. So reminding people who are, and that's why I was so excited to be in this panel and to participate in SICSS, is that folks might not identify as developers, but you're coming with a wealth of knowledge that is so needed and so important for this work. So like, I think framing it differently, like what are all of the like wealth of exposures to other forms of media that you come with, a lifetime of stories to tell, all these other perspectives that you bring that is going to challenge like the existing way of doing things. So I feel like the more we can build people's awareness of all of the strengths and assets that they build, that they bring to the process, the better. And I hate the fact that we've limited it to be like, well, you have to be a computer scientist. And I'm a computer scientist. And I'm like, no, like, I wanted to work with social scientists in my PhD because I had so much to learn from them. So I just want to say that too.
So we have a question from Daniel at the SICSS-Howard Mathematica site. Your dissertation research is fascinating. I'm interested in how lasting the racial ethnic socializing effects of simulations are. Do these effects last over time? How do these effects compare to those of more traditional forms of racial ethnic socialization in the real world, like K-12 schooling?
I really wish Dr. Cogburn were here because, yeah, this is not like a question I can easily answer, but I'd say that it's always a variety of socialization sources. And I'd say like definitely look into that literature on racial and ethnic socialization to understand like the influences and interactions between them. But I will say the paper that I referred to earlier on racialized pedagogical zones, video games and TV shows and like, you know, all of these things like are very strong socialization sources. And I think like, I don't want to dismiss it as like, you know, this is the model, but like for certain individuals, I would argue that, yeah, video games and other forms of media will probably be more powerful and lasting than maybe one's parents, depending on the involvement or messaging frequency type that they receive from their parents. So yeah, I'd say definitely look back at that amazing social science literature to kind of learn more about this topic.
And we have a second question from Erica, also from our site. So based on the participants of your study, did you study the difference of how different groups interact with the tool? Where were you able to learn from the educators group if the results were influenced by race, ethnicity, gender, or other factors?
Yeah, so the system that Erica's referring to is Passage Home, which is an interactive narrative video game system, which simulates an encounter between a Black high school student who's brilliant and created this amazing essay, and she's falsely accused of plagiarism by her white teacher. Basically, in the experience, you're having to kind of respond to this encounter. And yes, The reason I didn't publish, like I didn't run any statistical analysis on race and gender is that that was not the primary purpose of it. I wanted to understand how ethnic identity development and socialization experiences influence the way that people perceived it. But the majority group of educators, pre-K through 12 educators we studied were white women, because that mimics like the overall population in the United States. And absolutely, I did find trends. The fact that white women with higher ethnic identity commitment, so saying like they felt very tied to their group, that was a barrier that actually impeded them from having empathy toward the character that they were in the role of. Like they empathized more with the teacher who was perpetrating racial violence against their avatar. So yes, absolutely. And yes, socialization actually did buffer that in some sense. So white women who did report higher levels of awareness of institutional discrimination and other forms of racism, they were able to kind of, that mitigated some of this. But yes, absolutely did understand that race and gender absolutely did play a role in their interpretation of the story.
Thank you, Danielle, for your critical research and the work that you're doing over at Apple. And I know there are folks that want to know a little bit about what it takes to get into your field. So if you want to share that in the chat box, I think that'd be greatly appreciated. We'll jump to Kyla. So we have questions. Our SICSS-Howard Mathematica students right now are finding themselves, some for the first time, in a predominantly Black academic space. You know, we don't all get that opportunity, and a lot of us are the only in our program. So Nayanthara wants to know about being the only woman of color graduating from your department in Michigan. As far as I know, you're still the only Black woman to get a PhD in computer science from that department. What were some of the major challenges that you faced on a daily basis? Did you face imposter syndrome? And if so, how did you deal with it?
Oh, wow. Yeah. So yes, and yes, and yes. So imposter syndrome through the roof. That's where I found out what imposter syndrome was. Every day, I think because our visual world, we're people, we're pattern matchers. We try to make sense of the world based on what we see. And so when I first came in, I'm like, okay, there's a Black girl, a Black guy, a Latin girl, Latin guy, and then all these white folks, international, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, okay, so they just tried to, you know, have their little quota. So to me, it was part of a quota system, but definitely had imposter syndrome. I would be in class and I remember, you know, the teacher would ask a question, someone raised their hand, answered immediately. I'm like, I haven't even processed that was a question. You know, everything was just happening so fast, and like definitely had imposter syndrome. I felt like, okay, everybody else here has seen this already. In some cases they had, because in other countries they get what we get on the grad level, you know, and the undergrad level. Some things that I definitely experienced that. I experienced a lot of I don't want to say not isolation, but isolation a bit in my department, but that changed because I did have some lab mates who, you know, I could begin to lean on, but in the beginning it was like, wow, I am the only one here. And, you know, after the first semester, I was on academic probation because I didn't heed good advice. See, Andre raising his hand too. I didn't heed good advice. I took, you know, classes that I probably should have spaced out across the years. I remember an advisor telling me, you know, I'm going to him to get some tips and strategies. And he's the person who's supposed to be the graduate school liaison, and he's a graduate student liaison rather. And he's like, well, I don't know what to tell you. I've never taught a Black person before. And I'm like, number one, the fact that you can go through your whole academic career and never teach a Black person that's number one. But also he only taught grad level classes, so I can kind of see that. But number two, I don't need special Black advice. Like, I just want you to help me with, you know, with what I'm going through, et cetera. So I also had that. I didn't have the best advisor situation. The one I came in with, you know, it didn't work out. But going to the grad chair, he actually told me, you know, hey, computer science isn't for everyone. Have you tried psychology? Have you tried education? So he starts naming, right, a big middle finger. So I don't know if you don't know me well, but the best way to get me to do something is tell me I'm not going to do it, or tell me not to, or discourage me. So I was like, no, this is not a question of my ability. I'm not having a good situation with this thing. I'm asking you for advice. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to have to take this PhD from here. It's not going to, you know, it's going to be rough. So All that to say, one of the things that really helped me through that was, again, community. I was only one in my PhD program, but there were like 3 other Black guys in my program. And then we had a larger group that was like a graduate version of NSBE, where, you know, everyone in the College of Engineering was able to come together. And then Courtney, I wish she was here. She was also at Michigan at the same time I was. And she was one of the heads of a larger group of just grad students who were of color. So like just having community outside of the department who I could just tell what was going on, and you know, I didn't have to explain so much. They're like, girl, you need me to come up there. My dissertation defense looked like a rally because there was so many Black people in the department, in a department that never sees Black people. They were like, oh, we're gonna have to give her this degree. But some of the things that helped me, I actually started running in grad school. And some of the metaphors for running also helped with that. Like my first race, you know, Michigan's close to Detroit. So one of the races I did, you could run over the bridge to Canada and then, you know, come back. And I'm running just like full speed, and there's an elderly man speed walking past me. And so like that did such a mental number for me, but then it was one of those, okay, at the end of the day, we're both going to get this medal. We're both going to get to the end. It doesn't matter that I'm expending all of my energy trying to do this half marathon and he is coasting. It does not matter. So to stop comparing myself, to stop looking at other people when I felt down, not trying to like hide what I was going through, like telling people what I was going through, because in the end, a lot of the help that I got came because I opened my mouth and told someone, hey, I'm having trouble analyzing these data. Oh, did you talk to my friend? Did you talk to the stats department? Do you know people have so many resources they know about, but if you just kind of suffer in silence, you will never know about it. But I'll stop talking. But all of that together really helped my experience there.
Fire. Thank you so much. So did you want to jump in on that too, Andre?
Yes. I know y'all may not be paying no attention to me because I've been talking all this humanist shit, but I have an information science degree. Thank you very much. And I need to say 2 things, especially given the Dobbs decision on Friday and Clarence Thomas's signaling that he's coming after other shit, everything but his own circumstances, which is that he's Black in public office and that he's married to a white woman. We just gonna slide over those things. But he's coming for contraception. He's coming for same sex. He's coming for sodomy laws, and he's coming for same-sex marriage, right? And I say these things, I feel like they need to be put in the conversation because I'm going to make a really difficult ask of you guys. All of us on this panel, every last one of us has been the one in our departments, in our graduate programs. Maybe we had 2, right? So like I had a young sister in my PhD program, and then the year I left, Sophia Noble joined Illinois for her PhD, right? So, but there's always one. Right. I'm the second Black man to get a PhD from the Illinois School of Information Science. They started in 1898. Right. So it's always going to be one of you. And right now, shit is mad precarious and hateful and ugly. Right. You are under so much stress. Basically, your stipend is not enough. Gas prices are ridiculous. Your advisor may have loved Black people, but don't know how to relate to you. Right. There's so many different things, but I'm asking you to stay the course. Because although diversity is not the final solution, because Clarence Thomas is on the Supreme Court and that ain't helping us none, it is a solution to some of the inequities that we're about to see happening. And most computer science, information science, and engineering departments are ill-equipped to understand the sociological and humanistic consequences of the technologies that they are devising. So I'm asking you not only to stick in your program and get this degree. We are here for you. You've got things that I didn't have when I was coming up, like Twitter and group chat and everything else. Build your virtual networks. But also, I'm asking you to take on an additional reading load. If you are not automatically inclined to think through anti-Blackness, or even reading Octavia Butler and Audre Lorde and James Baldwin, I ask you to take up your reading on those subjects as well, because those are the ways that you will understand better what types of fuck shit you've gotten yourself into wanting to join this community, this community of practice, right? That is computation, algorithmic, artificial intelligence, and algorithmic design, right? Only by understanding the sociological and humanistic aspects will you be the best computer scientist you can be. You'll be head and shoulders above your white colleagues, even though they'll get promoted before you, even though they'll get better access to resources, but you'll be a better scientist than they are because you understand that the technologies you're deploying will be deployed in a human context. right? As opposed to some first principles idea that if you just make it better or faster or more elegant, it will work better, right? And so that's my ask. Build a virtual network of people who may not be in your department that can still support you. Two, understand you're not alone, right? A lot of us have been through it. Those who say they haven't, they lying to themselves, right? But three, be prepared to understand that the dissertation is not an end goal of your learning. And your coursework is not enough to help you understand the world. You have to take on additional readings in order to be the best person you can be. So I'll leave that there.
What an incredible end to our panel.
Let Danielle say something.
Danielle gets the last word. She been voluntold my brother Andre. I'm so sorry, Danielle. Take it away.
No, I just want to say thank you for letting me be part of this. And thank you to everybody that's participating in this program, because your voices matter, your ideas matter, your lifelong experiences are in and of themselves like huge like assets as you're going to contribute to the field. So I'm just so excited to kind of hear like what you all think of, talk about, create. Yeah, we have a lot to learn from you. So.
Kyla, do you want to squeeze in a last word before Andre tells me I skipped something?
You know, I'm good. This has been a great conversation. I feel like we could do this for another hour. I don't know if it's going to set that up, but
I'm on it. In fact, I already wrote to Courtney and I said, you know, maybe we could squeeze you in for a one-on-one this week. This has been incredible. You know, just so much knowledge on research and equity and ethics and just being Black in the academy, being Black in industry. You all, your voices are so needed. You know, we're the culture. You know, not a monolith, but we're creating everything, whether we get credit or not for it. We're creating everything, and I'm so deeply appreciative for the time that you've spent with us today. Thank you all in our audience for joining us for SICSS-Howard Mathematica Live Q&A session. Please don't let the conversation end here. Follow these folks on Twitter. And you know, show up in their classrooms, not at their houses. Okay, let's let these people have their time. But thank you for watching. Thank you all for watching. For more information on SICSS-Howard Mathematica, visit our website, follow us on social media, and join our email list.